Good morning, Wabash. Today, speaking at Pioneer Chapel is Dr. Daniel Rogers with his talk entitled, Get Off My Damn Lawn. Dr. Rogers has taught Spanish and Hispanic studies at Wabash since 1998. An immigrant to Indiana, he completed a BA at the University of Colorado and an MA and PhD from the University of Kansas. Rock chalk? Dr. Rogers' favorite thing in the world is to help students understand the difference between the preterite and the imperfect, but he also loves reading and teaching Latin American literature. He'll take students to Ecuador at the end of the semester for a summer study in Ecuador, a program he developed and has led since 2004. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I ran into David Wagner a couple days ago, who was on campus. David's now a principal in South Texas, and he went on the 2004 Ecuador program. So we had a great time reminiscing about one of the earlier iterations of the Ecuador program. What a great time to be speaking, right? Right after the day of giving, right? So, you know, a lot of excitement there. And next week is senior week, right? 2 weeks. Well, still 2 weeks away. No, it's fantastic. I don't see the dean here. Oh, there he is. Oh, darn. All right. I was going to say, wouldn't it be better for the dean to give the chapel talk right after the day of giving? In fact, we should start a new tradition. Don't you think the dean should give a chapel talk every month? I mean, stay connected. There we go. No, this seemed like a good idea back in January when Frank invited me to give the talk. I told him I would do so on the condition that he double major in Spanish. 18 classes. I explained it to him in 300 level Spanish, but he's only in my 102 class. So surprise. Let's see. Well, and I got to give a shout out to my any 102 students I have. There we go. There's see the 1 o'clock section there. I told them that if they paid close attention to the last letter of the first word of every other paragraph, that I have encoded the answers to the final exam there. So, so take note. I have been getting my hair cut at the same place now, off and on, for over 20 years. Yeah, no. Yeah. That's a long time for not much hair. That's like David Byrne, Talking Heads, same as it ever was, territory. And if you're a millennial, you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's called Carpenter's Barbershop. And I know that there are some Wabash guys. I think Harry Hallstrom gets his haircut there. I think there's some guys on the baseball team. And you know Carpenter's? It's this tiny little red house on South Boulevard, just east of the new Domino's Pizza. And if you get your haircut there, like I do, you can learn everything you need to know about Crawfordsville and the county. Like I said, I've been going there since the late 90s. And I'm not kidding, I'm still very much a newcomer. Bill Carpenter has been cutting Wabash students and faculty hair since 1958. To give you a sense of how long ago that was, think of this. He's been cutting Os Brooks' hair. Do you know who Os Brooks is? Okay. Os Brooks graduated from Wabash College in 1961, went to grad school, came back, had a 40-year career, and has been retired now for like 15 years. And he's still getting his hair cut by the same guy, Bill Carpenter. The place is usually filled with old guys, much older than me, complaining about their lawns and the young kids who take shortcuts through them. It kind of worries me because I'm so old now that I'm getting my hair cut with guys that are, making sense to me now in some ways. If you went to Bert Barretto's talk on Tuesday, he summed it up perfectly. He said, old people tend to be pessimistic, conservative, and static. In fact, he quoted Frank Bruni's recent column in the New York Times. And if you don't know what that is, pick up a paper. Bruni explains what it means to get old perfectly. And so I'm going to quote Bruni's article here. Bruni says, quote, when you get older, what you want from restaurants, it turns out, is a proxy for what you want from love and from life. All reflect the arc that you've traveled, the peace that you have or haven't made. When I was 34, I wanted bling because it persuaded me that I was special. When I was 44, I wanted blinis because they made me feel sophisticated. And at 54, I just want martinis because I'm certain of what's in them and what they'll do. End quotes. Bruni might have entitled his column, "Get Off My Lawn and Give Me My Martinis." But it also illustrates the danger of stasis, of getting old and not changing and forgetting where we come from. If I follow Bruni's advice too closely, I risk turning into more of a curmudgeon. Which brings me to the title of my talk, right? You kids, get off my lawn. It's an expression that has its roots in the rise of suburbia in the 1950s, just about the time that Bill Carpenter started cutting hair. I'm not kidding. A dictionary of idioms tells us that, quote, this phrase presents the supposed reaction of stereotypically older middle class, the elderly middle class homeowner confronting boisterous children. Today, the phrase mocks trivial complaints, and particularly those of older people regarding the young. The idiom was popularized by David Letterman. David Letterman? It was a popular late-night guy back when television came through the air into antennas rather than on your iPhones. Letterman is from Indiana, so he understands the strange bond between Hoosiers and their yards. Until the late 19th century, private lawns, in the modern sense, were mainly associated with wealthy estates. You know the kind, the houses on Meridian, north of 40th. During America's post-World War II economic expansion, homes with big lawns in the suburbs became an important symbol of affluence. So Get Off My Lawn is as much about American notions of property rights and affluence as it is about intergenerational conflict, I think. And this, unfortunately, in my opinion, has come to be associated with attitudes toward immigration. The idiom is kind of morphing now from the David Letterman funny version into more of a Clint Eastwood version from the movie Gran Torino, Get Off My Lawn. It's coming to mean something, I'm afraid, like immigrants don't come here. Now, my students know that I love etymologies. I love the study of the history of words and their relationship to words from different languages. And I frequently tell them that learning a new language, aside from giving you the opportunity to speak with people in different places and in different cultures, it gives you X-ray vision into your own language, the language that you learned without thinking about it when you were growing up. Let me tell you a true story about how this works. When I was a senior in college, I decided to go to graduate school rather than seek gainful employment. So I had to take the GRE, which is like, if you don't know, it's like the SAT or ACT for getting into grad school. And it typically contains a section that tests your vocabulary through analogies. Well, long story short, back in the fall of 1990, I was taking the GRE. I was nervous, kind of the weight of the world on your shoulders, conscious of, am I going to do well or not? What's going to happen? I get to this section on analogies, and the very first word I run into is the word risible. Risible. I can tell by your stares that you were feeling exactly what I was feeling at that moment. I had not run into it before. Of course, now I see it everywhere. It's like, if you learn a new word, then you start seeing it everywhere. But, I did not know that word. Clock is ticking. There are many more words and questions I need to get through, I hadn't learned yet that life has a way of working itself out. That very few times is everything really dependent on whether you know the definition of the word risible. But I was feeling like Chris Farley's character on Saturday Night Live, like I was going to end up living in a van down by the river, eating government cheese. So as I was passing through this state of anxiety, I looked over at the matching options and noticed that one of the words had something to do with to laugh and laughable. And I went back to risible, and I realized that buried inside that word is the Spanish word risa and the Spanish word risible, which I knew meant laughter and laughable. And all of a sudden, I realized, okay, I can do this. I can take this exam. The word risible comes from the Latin word risibilis. So the English word went through Old French and then into English. And in Spanish, of course, it just came directly from Latin. So I filled in the little bubble with my number 2 pencil and really felt relief washing over me. So yes, if you take a foreign language, you too will do well on the GRE. So this is the point of the talk where I need to bring both things together, immigration and etymology. But oddly, it's kind of impossible. Although there is clearly a clearly established etymology for the word migrate, there isn't one for immigrate. Put that I-M in front of it. So migrate comes from the Latin word, the verb in the infinitive migrare, and Hartnett says I always pronounce Latin like I'm a Spanish speaker, which is true. Migrare, and it means to change one's residence or position, to move from place to place, to pass into a new condition or form, to move or shift. So, and this is important, migrate can have a really concrete meaning, moving from place to place, or it can have a more metaphorical sense. To change your position, to change one's position on things is to experience a kind of migration. But notice that the word migrate originally didn't have anything to do with nationality. That's why animals can migrate, right? Monarch butterflies, humpback whales, all those animals and humans can migrate. To immigrate, however, is a different story. Neil Shumsky, a historian at Virginia Tech, has a great article that I tweeted out a couple of days ago entitled Noah Webster and the Invention of Immigration. You remember Noah Webster is the guy who wrote the famous dictionary in 1828, 4 years before the founding of Wabash College. Well, here's what Shumsky says about Noah Webster. He says, quote, Noah Webster, author of An American Dictionary of the English Language, invented the word immigration. That is, he took an existing word, migrate, migration, and changed it. He did this based on his long study of word origins and perhaps his own experience as an ardent American nationalist, and in doing so created a definition that had never appeared before in any dictionary of the English language. By telling Americans that immigration involves coming from another country, Webster set up an us versus them opposition, foreigner against native born. Of course, that idea had always existed, it just hadn't been encoded in one word like that. By telling Americans that immigration is permanent and involves the intent of residence, Webster encouraged them to fear that in time they might be displaced. So if you heard Bert Barretto's talk again on Tuesday, you'll know, and he talked about demographics, you'll know that just the opposite is in fact the case, but I'm running out of time, so I'll leave that for another day. So rather than conclude with a rant, as would be befitting a curmudgeon. Let me tell you a quick story to end on. I found a firsthand account of some migrants, a family who fled violence in Mexico and crossed the border in El Paso. You know where El Paso is? Do we have students from El Paso here? I know we have at Wabash, we have a few guys from El Paso. So this is a true story, and it comes from a journal that I found of a Mexican immigrant who had been a little boy at the time of the Mexican Revolution. So I'm going to quote his words now. He says, in English, he was a fluent Spanish speaker, but also knew English. Quote, "I was born in Colonia Juarez, Chihuahua, November 22nd, 1911. It was a time when Mexico was in turmoil. There were several rebel forces trying to overthrow the government, one of which was Pancho Villa. Well, in the spring of 1917, now he's 6 years old, at the time of the second major wave of violence in Chihuahua, when Pancho Villa was still trying to gain control, word came into town that General Carranza and his men were just a few miles outside of the town. We'd gotten word a number of days before that we could expect them. So my father, who had always had a year's supply of chopped wood, he had taken practically all of our valuables out of the house, our dishes, bedding, anything that the men might have wanted to pick up and take with them. And he put those valuables in trunks and boxes and piled a large stack of chopped wood on top. About 300 men camped in the lane in front of our barn. After these men had scouted around and found that we had a lot of hay in our barn and a lot of wood for their campfires, they decided this was a good place to camp while they scouted for other valuables that might help them on their journey. The night before they left, I remember so vividly, we were sitting around the table eating supper. A knock came at the back door. You could tell that it was made by the butt of a gun. My father went to the door and two carrancistas walked in, guns in hand. They had 2 ammunition belts crisscrossed across their shoulders and chests, and they did not remove their big hats when they entered the house. They demanded bedding and food. My father took them through the house. They ransacked and checked closely to see what they could find. The reason they were leaving is that they had used up all the hay in the barn. My father mentioned that if they'd gotten through the wood first, they would have found our valuables. At this point, they decide they have to leave, and they get on the train and head to El Paso and cross the border. So, because of this experience, that little boy and his family fled across the border to seek asylum in the United States. And just like asylum seekers we see today on television, they fled in fear and from fear and toward hope. They made it across. The little boy ended up at the University of Arizona on an athletic scholarship, like so many other immigrant kids today. And just before he turned 80 years old, near the very end of his life, he decided to become a U.S. citizen. He took the test, was sworn in 4 years before he died. He gave up his green card. And I remember that green card that allowed him to live in El Paso. The kid in this story was my grandfather. He got married, had a family, and one of his daughters, who was born in El Paso, ironically, on Cinco de Mayo, well, she had me. And I remember visiting my cousins in Mexico when I was a little kid, and my grandfather having to show his green card to get back across the border. If the United States citizens at that time had said to his family, "You can't come in," if they'd said, "Get off our damn lawn," my whole family might have never been. My grandfather eventually bought a pecan orchard, and he helped run a John Deere dealership, and he contributed to the economy in the community, and he left a lot of amazing descendants. So, in telling this story, I take my cue from another professor on this faculty who I really admire, Dr. Shamira Gelbman in political science. If you follow her Twitter feed, you'll know that as a political scientist, she often uses genealogy rather than polarizing debate to talk about issues surrounding the politics of immigration and other things. Inspired by her, I started looking for documents about my own family's past in Mexico. So Pope Francis says, quote, "The only time it's permissible to look down on people is when you're there to help them get up." And if you prefer philosophers to popes, few have confronted questions like these more directly than Emmanuel Levinas. If you haven't heard of Levinas, take a course in the philosophy department. Professor Cheryl Hughes is one of our resident experts on Levinas. Born into a Jewish family in Lithuania, Levinas moved to France in 23, and he studied philosophy under Martin Heidegger. His work was interrupted by the Second World War, and he eventually ends up taken prisoner by the Nazis in 1940. His status as an officer prevented him from being sent to a concentration camp, but all the members of his immediate family perished, victims of the Nazis, for their Jewish faith and ancestry. So after the war, one of Levinas's abiding concerns was to describe the concrete source of ethical relations between human beings, our ability to respond to the wants and needs of others. Levinas shows us that hospitality not only determines our identities in specific communities, but it's also a way of constructing humanity. Hospitality is the basis of human community. It's literally living humanely. To live humanely is to welcome people who aren't like me in any number of ways into my life, into my fraternity, my living unit, my athletic team, my church, my town, and schools. So, while it remains one of my favorite taglines, let's banish "get off my lawn" from conversations about immigration. Thank you.